Jessica had been planning this trip for almost 3 years. Every month, she put aside money from her job at the local grocery store. Sometimes it was just $20. Other months, when she worked extra shifts, she could save $50 or even $75. She kept the money in an old coffee tin on her kitchen counter, and every time she added to it, she would smile and think about the day she could finally take her twin daughters on the vacation they deserved. Life as a single mother wasn't easy. After her divorce 2 years ago, money was always tight. There were school supplies to buy, clothes that the girls outgrew too quickly, and unexpected expenses that seemed to pop up every month. But Jessica never stopped dreaming about giving her daughters something special, something they would remember forever. When she finally counted the money in that coffee tin and realized she had enough for a cruise, Jessica couldn't believe it. She had saved $2,400. It was enough for a 7-day Caribbean cruise for all three of them. She booked it immediately. Before she could change her mind or find some other way to spend the money, the twins, Mia and Zoe, had just turned 16. They were good kids who rarely asked for anything expensive. They understood that money was tight, and they never complained when their friends got new phones or designer clothes that they couldn't afford. When Jessica surprised them with the cruise tickets for their birthday, both girls started crying. Happy tears that made Jessica's heart feel like it might burst with joy. For weeks leading up to the trip, the three of them researched everything about cruise ships. They looked at photos of the dining rooms, the pools, the entertainment venues. They read reviews and watched videos online. The girls made lists of everything they wanted to do. They wanted to try rock climbing on the ship, go to the teen dance club, maybe even try karaoke night. Jessica was just excited to see her daughters happy and carefree for once. The ship was called Ocean Dream, and it was bigger than anything Jessica had ever seen. When they first walked up the gangway, all three of them stopped and stared. It was like a floating city, 15 decks high with restaurants, shops, theaters, and pools. There were over 3,000 passengers on board, plus more than 1,000 crew members. Jessica felt a little overwhelmed, but the girls were absolutely thrilled. Their cabin was small but comfortable. 2 beds and a tiny bathroom, with a window that looked out at the ocean. The girls immediately claimed the bed closest to the window and spent the first hour just watching the waves. Jessica had never seen them so excited about anything. First 2 days of the cruise were perfect. They ate at the buffet every morning, trying foods they had never tasted before. They spent hours by the pool, reading books and soaking up the sun. In the evenings, they watched shows in the theater. The girls loved the magic show on the first night and the comedy act on the second night. Jessica couldn't remember the last time she had laughed so hard. On the second day, they stopped at a small island in the Caribbean. The three of them went snorkeling together. Neither Jessica nor the girls had ever done it before, but the instructor was patient and kind. They saw colorful fish and even a small reef shark that swam right past them. The girls talked about it for hours afterward, replaying every moment. That evening, Jessica started feeling unwell. It began as a small headache during dinner, but by the time they got back to their cabin, her head was pounding. She had suffered from migraines since she was a teenager, and she recognized the warning signs. The bright lights in the ship's corridors made it worse, and she felt nauseous. The girls were disappointed that their mom wasn't feeling well, but they understood. They had seen her deal with migraines before. Jessica took some medication and told them she needed to lie down in the dark for a few hours. She encouraged the girls to go explore the ship without her. They were 16, responsible, and the ship was safe. There were security cameras everywhere and crew members on every deck. Mia and Zoe had been looking forward to the teen club since before they even boarded the ship. It was on deck 12, and according to the ship's daily newsletter, there would be games, dancing, and snacks. The club was only open to passengers between ages 13 and 17, so it was a chance for them to meet other kids their age. Jessica watched her daughters get ready to go out. They'd put on their favorite dresses and spent time doing each other's hair. They were so excited, chattering about what the teen club would be like and hoping they would make some friends. Jessica gave them each a hug and reminded them to be back in the cabin by midnight. The girls promised they would, and Jessica believed them. They had never given her any reason not to trust them. As the cabin door closed behind her daughters, Jessica felt a mix of relief and worry. Relief that she could finally rest her aching head in the quiet darkness of the cabin. Worry because this was the first time she had let the girls go off on their own in such a big, unfamiliar place. But she pushed the worry aside. They were smart girls, and the ship was full of families with children. What could possibly go wrong? Jessica took another pain medication and pulled the blackout curtains across the small window. The cabin became completely dark, which helped with her migraine. She could hear the low hum of the ship's engines and the distant sound of music and laughter from somewhere. On the upper decks, it was oddly comforting. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. She dozed on and off for several hours. At one point, she thought she heard voices in the hallway outside their cabin. But when she checked the time, it was only 9:30. Too early for the girls to be back. She took another sip of water and tried to get more sleep. Around 11:15, Jessica woke up feeling much better. Her headache was almost gone, and she felt hungry for the first time all day. She thought about ordering room service, but then decided to wait for the girls to come back. They could all get a late-night snack together from one of the 24-hour cafes on the ship. Midnight came and went. Jessica wasn't worried at first. The girls were probably having so much fun that they lost track of time. It happened to teenagers all the time. She decided to give them until 12:30 before she started looking for them. By 1 in the morning. Jessica was getting concerned. This wasn't like her daughters. They were usually very good about keeping their promises, especially when it came to curfews. She put on her shoes and jacket and decided to go look for them. The teen club was on deck 12, but when Jessica got there, it was closed. The lights were off and there was a security rope across the entrance. A crew member was cleaning up, and when Jessica asked about her daughters, he said the club had closed at midnight. He didn't remember seeing two girls matching their description, but he said there had been about 40 teenagers there. Throughout the evening, Jessica felt the first flutter of real panic in her stomach. Where could they be? She walked through the ship's corridors, checking every public area she could find. The pool deck was empty except for a few adults having drinks at the bar. The arcade was closed. The ice cream parlor was dark. She went back to their cabin, hoping the girls had returned while she was looking for them. But the cabin was empty, exactly as she had left it. Their bed hadn't been slept in. Their pajamas were still folded on the pillow where they had left them before going out. By 3 in the morning, Jessica knew something was very wrong. She called the ship's security office from the phone in her cabin. Her voice was shaking as she explained that her daughters were missing. The security officer on the phone was calm and professional. He said this kind of thing happened sometimes, that teenagers often lost track of time or fell asleep in a quiet corner somewhere on the ship. He assured her that they would find the girls and asked her to come to the security office on deck 5. When Jessica arrived at the security office, there were already several crew members preparing to search the ship. They asked her for recent photos of the girls, which she had on her phone. They asked what the girls were wearing, where they had planned to go, and if they had ever done anything like this before. Jessica answered every question, but she knew in her heart that something terrible had happened. The search began immediately. Crew members spread out across all 15 decks of the massive ship. They checked every public area, every restaurant, every lounge. They knocked on cabin doors and asked other passengers if they had seen two 16-year-old girls. They checked the medical center in case the girls had been injured. They even checked the restricted crew areas in case the girls had somehow wandered into a part of the ship where passengers weren't allowed. As the sun began to rise over the ocean, Jessica stood on the deck and watched the crew members continue their search. The ship was still moving toward their next destination, but Jessica couldn't think about anything except finding her daughters. Where could they be on a ship in the middle of the ocean? How could two people just disappear? The truth was more terrifying than Jessica could have ever imagined. But she wouldn't learn that truth for another 10 months. By sunrise, the entire cruise ship had become a massive search operation. The captain had made an announcement over the ship's speakers, asking all passengers to check their cabins and any areas where they might have seen two 16-year-old girls. The description was broadcast every hour. Mia, wearing a blue sundress with white flowers, and Zoe in a yellow top and white shorts. Both girls had long brown hair and were about 5 feet 4 inches tall. Jessica felt like she was living in a nightmare. She walked through the ship's corridors with security officers, showing Mia and Zoe's photos to anyone who would look. Some passengers were helpful and kind, taking time to really study the pictures and think about whether they had seen the girls. Others seemed annoyed to be bothered during their vacation. Jessica didn't care about their reactions. She just needed to find her daughters. The security team pulled up surveillance footage from cameras all over the ship. There were hundreds of cameras, covering almost every public area. Jessica sat in the security office, watching hours of black and white video footage. It was mind-numbing work, scanning through crowds of people, looking for any sign of her girls. Finally, they found something. At 11:47 the night before, there was clear footage of Mia and Zoe leaving the teen club together. They were laughing about something, looking happy and carefree. Jessica's heart broke watching them. They looked so young and innocent, walking through the ship without any idea of what was about to happen to them. The footage showed the girls walking toward the elevators. They got into an elevator with several other people. The next camera picked them up on deck 10, still walking together, still looking normal and happy. Then there was another shot of them on deck 11, heading toward the stairs that led to the upper decks. After that, nothing. The girls simply vanished from all camera coverage. The security team explained that there were some areas of the ship that didn't have cameras, mostly on the higher decks where there were fewer passengers. But even those areas had been thoroughly searched by crew members. The Coast Guard was contacted when the ship was still 12 hours from the nearest port. By the time they docked in Jamaica, there were already Coast Guard vessels waiting in the harbor. Jessica watched from the ship's deck as boats surrounded the Ocean Dream, helicopters flew overhead, and divers in the water checked around the ship's hull. The Coast Guard commander, a woman named Lieutenant Rodriguez, came aboard to speak with Jessica personally. She was professional but kind, explaining that they would do everything possible to find the girls. She asked Jessica the same questions the ship's security had already asked, but Jessica answered them all again, hoping that some small detail might help. Lieutenant Rodriguez explained that they had to consider all possibilities. Maybe the girls had fallen overboard accidentally. Maybe they had jumped. Maybe they were still somewhere on the ship, hiding or trapped. Jessica refused to believe that her daughters would jump. They were happy, well-adjusted kids who had been excited about the cruise. And if they had fallen accidentally, surely someone would have heard them scream for help. The search expanded beyond just the ship. Coast Guard cutters spread out in a grid pattern, searching the waters along the ship's route from the previous night. They used sonar equipment to scan the ocean floor. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew back and forth, looking for any sign of life in the water. Their passengers were interviewed one by one. The Coast Guard and FBI agents who had flown in asked everyone if they had seen anything unusual the night before. Had they noticed the two girls talking to anyone? Had they seen them with any adults? Had they witnessed any kind of argument or disturbance? Most passengers had nothing useful to report. A few people remembered seeing two girls, who might have been Mia and Zoe, but their stories were vague and didn't provide any real clues. One teenage boy said he had talked to them briefly at the teen club, but he said they seemed fine and were planning to go get some ice cream before going back to their cabin. The ship's crew was also questioned extensively. Every crew member who had been working the night shift was interviewed. Their backgrounds were checked, their movements during the evening were documented. The cruise line brought in their own security, investigators to work alongside the Coast Guard and FBI. Jessica couldn't eat or sleep. She spent every waking moment either searching the ship herself or sitting in the security office watching more surveillance footage. She memorized every face of every crew member she encountered, wondering if one of them knew something about what had happened to her daughters. On the second day of the search, the ship had to continue to its next scheduled port. Jessica begged them not to leave, but the captain explained that they had 3,000 other passengers who needed to get to their destinations. The search would continue, but the ship couldn't stay anchored indefinitely. Jessica made the hardest decision of her life. She decided to stay behind in Jamaica while the ship continued its route. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving the area where her daughters had disappeared. The cruise line arranged for her luggage to be removed from the ship, and Jessica found herself standing on a dock in a foreign country, completely alone. The local Jamaican police were helpful but realistic. They explained that if the girls had fallen into the ocean anywhere near Jamaica, the currents would likely carry them away from the island. But they promised to alert all their coastal stations and fishing boats to watch for any signs. Jessica rented a small hotel room near the harbor and began what would become a 10-month obsession. Every morning, she walked along the beaches looking for any clue. She talked to fishermen, asking them to keep an eye out for anything unusual in their nets. She visited hospitals and police stations, showing photos of her daughters to anyone who would look. The Coast Guard search continued for 2 weeks. They covered thousands of square miles of ocean, following currents and wind patterns to predict where anything in the water might have drifted. They found debris from other ships, pieces of trash, even some personal items that had been lost overboard from various vessels. But they found nothing that belonged to Mia and Zoe. Back home, Jessica's sister Lisa was handling the media attention. The story of the missing twins had made national news. Television reporters wanted interviews, and newspaper journalists called constantly. Lisa tried to protect Jessica from most of it, but she also knew that media coverage might help find the girls. Jessica's ex-husband flew to Jamaica to try to convince her to come home. He was grieving too, but he believed the girls were gone. He thought Jessica was torturing herself by staying in the Caribbean, chasing false hopes. Their conversation was painful and angry. Jessica accused him of giving up on their daughters. He accused her of refusing to face reality. After he left, Jessica felt more alone than ever. But she couldn't bring herself to go home. Home meant admitting that Mia and Zoe were never coming back. As long as she stayed and kept searching, there was still hope. The cruise line's insurance company eventually settled with Jessica, offering her a substantial sum of money. Jessica's lawyer advised her to take it, explaining that it didn't mean she was admitting the girls were dead. It just meant the cruise line was taking responsibility for what had happened on their ship. Jessica used every penny of that settlement money to continue her search. She hired private investigators who specialized in missing persons cases. She consulted with maritime experts who understood ocean currents and survival techniques. She even reached out to psychics and people who claimed to have supernatural abilities to find missing people. Most of the private investigators were honest with her about the slim chances of finding the girls alive after so much time had passed. But a few gave her hope, suggesting theories about what might have happened. Maybe the girls had been taken off the ship at one of the ports. Maybe they were being held somewhere against their will. Maybe they had somehow survived and were stranded on one of the many small, uninhabited islands scattered throughout the Caribbean. Month after month, Jessica continued her search. She learned to speak basic Spanish so she could communicate better with local fishermen and police officers. She became a familiar face at Coast Guard stations throughout the Caribbean. Some of the officers admired her determination. Others thought she was a broken woman who couldn't accept the truth. Jessica's life back home fell apart completely. She lost her job at the grocery store because she couldn't return to work. Her small house went into foreclosure because she couldn't make the mortgage payments while spending all her money on the search. Friends and family members tried to convince her to come home and start rebuilding her life, but Jessica couldn't imagine a life without her daughters. As the months passed, fewer and fewer people believed the girls might still be alive. The official search had been called off long ago. The media had moved on to other stories. Even some of Jessica's hired investigators had quietly stopped working on the case. though they continued to cash her checks, but Jessica never stopped believing. Every morning, she woke up with the same thought. Today might be the day she found her daughters. Every phone call might be the one with news. Every knock on her hotel room door might bring the miracle she was praying for. By the 4th month, Jessica's world had completely collapsed. Her marriage, which had been struggling even before the cruise, finally ended when her husband David filed for divorce. He couldn't understand why she refused to come home and start the grieving process. During their last phone call, he said something that cut Jessica to her core. "You're choosing to search for ghosts instead of healing with the people who are still alive." Jessica hung up the phone and cried for hours in her small hotel room in Kingston, Jamaica. But even through her tears, she knew she couldn't give up. David didn't understand that every fiber of her being told her the girls were still alive somewhere. A mother's instinct, she told herself. She would know if they were gone. She would feel it in her heart. The hotel manager, Mrs. Patterson, had become like a grandmother to Jessica. She was a kind Jamaican woman in her 60s who had raised 5 children of her own. She often brought Jessica home-cooked meals and sat with her when the loneliness became too much to bear. Mrs. Patterson never told Jessica to give up hope, but she gently encouraged her to take better care of herself. "Child, you can't find your babies if you don't eat," Mrs. Patterson would say, placing a plate of rice and beans in front of Jessica. "They gonna need their mama to be strong when they come home." Jessica had lost almost 30 pounds since arriving. In Jamaica, her clothes hung loose on her frame and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She barely slept, spending most nights walking the beaches with a flashlight, calling out her daughters' names into the darkness. The local police had stopped questioning her nighttime wanderings. They understood her pain, even if they thought her search was hopeless. During the day, Jessica had developed a routine that kept her busy and gave her purpose. She would start each morning by checking in with the Coast Guard station, even though they had officially ended their search months ago. Lieutenant Rodriguez had been transferred to another post, but the new officer, Sergeant Williams, was patient with Jessica's daily visits. After the Coast Guard station, Jessica would visit the 3 internet cafes in Kingston, printing new flyers with her daughter's photos. She had translated the flyers into Spanish and even learned some basic Creole phrases to communicate better with locals. The flyers were weathered and faded now, but she continued to post them on every bulletin board, telephone pole, and shop window that would allow it. Her afternoons were spent at the harbor, talking to fishermen and boat captains. She had memorized the schedules of every fishing vessel and charter boat that operated out of Kingston. She knew which captains were heading to which islands, and she always asked them to keep an eye out for any signs of her daughters. Captain Morrison, who ran a small charter fishing business, had become one of Jessica's closest allies. He was a weathered man in his 50s who had been fishing Caribbean waters for 30 years. He understood the ocean currents better than anyone, and he had helped Jessica create a map of all the small, uninhabited islands where someone might survive if they were stranded. "The thing about these waters," Captain Morrison explained one afternoon as they studied the map together, "is that the currents are tricky. Something that goes into the water here might end up way over there." He pointed to a cluster of tiny islands about 50 miles southeast of Jamaica. Most of these little islands don't even have names. Nobody ever goes there. Jessica hired Captain Morrison to take her to some of these remote islands. They spent weekends searching beaches that probably hadn't seen human footprints in years. Jessica would walk every inch of shoreline, looking for any sign that someone had been there. A piece of clothing, a shelter, footprints in the sand. She found plenty of debris that had washed ashore from passing ships, but nothing that belonged to her daughters. The private investigators Jessica had hired were costing her a fortune, but most of them had produced no real results. One investigator, a man named Rodriguez, who claimed to have connections throughout the Caribbean, took $5,000 from Jessica and then disappeared completely. Another investigator, a woman from Miami, spent weeks following false leads about 2 girls who had been seen in various Caribbean ports, but none of the sightings turned out to be Mia and Zoe. Jessica's sister Lisa called every week, begging her to come home. Their conversations were becoming more strained as time passed. Lisa was worried about Jessica's mental health and her financial situation. The settlement money from the cruise line was running out fast, and Jessica had no income. "Jess, you've been gone for 6 months," Lisa said during one particularly difficult call. "You've lost your house, your job, your marriage. What's left? You can't search forever." "I can search until I find them," Jessica replied firmly. "Or until I know for certain what happened to them. I won't abandon my daughters, Lisa. I won't." "Lisa, tried a different approach. What if they didn't survive the first night? What if you're torturing yourself for nothing?" Jessica's response was always the same. "I would know. A mother would know if her children were gone. I don't feel that. I feel like they're out there somewhere, waiting for me to find them." As the months wore on, Jessica's search became more desperate and more creative. She reached out to anyone who might have information or connections that could help. She contacted marine biologists who studied Caribbean waters, hoping they might know about currents or islands she hadn't considered. She spoke with anthropologists who had studied the indigenous peoples of the region, wondering if there were inhabited islands that didn't appear on modern maps. She even consulted with survival experts, trying to understand what would be possible. If 2 teenagers were stranded on a deserted island, could they find fresh water? Could they catch fish or find edible plants? How long could they survive without rescue? The experts were honest but not encouraging. Yes, it was theoretically possible for someone to survive on a tropical island, especially if they had some basic knowledge and were lucky enough to find fresh water. But the chances of 2 16-year-old girls from suburban America having the skills to survive for months in such conditions were very slim. Jessica refused to be discouraged by the odds. She bought books about survival techniques and island foraging, studying them as if she were preparing for a test. She learned about which plants were edible, how to collect rainwater, and how to signal for rescue. In her mind, if her daughters were stranded somewhere, they would need this knowledge to survive until she found them. The local Jamaican community had mixed feelings about the American woman who had been living among them for so long. Some admired her determination and refused to give up hope. They would stop Jessica on the street to ask if there was any news, and they genuinely seemed to care about the outcome. Others thought she was mentally unstable and needed professional help. Dr. Williams, a local physician who ran a small clinic, had examined Jessica several times when exhaustion and poor nutrition had made her sick. He was concerned about her physical and mental health, but he also understood that forcing her to stop searching might destroy her completely. Grief affects people differently, he explained to Mrs. Patterson one day when they were discussing Jessica's condition. Some people accept loss and move on. Others fight against it until they have no strength left. I don't know which way is better. Jessica's financial situation was becoming critical. The settlement money was almost gone and she had no source of income. She had sold her car before leaving for Jamaica, and her house had gone into foreclosure. Her credit cards were maxed out from paying investigators and funding her search efforts. Mrs. Patterson offered to let Jessica work at the hotel in exchange for her room, but Jessica was too obsessed with searching to commit to regular work hours. She did odd jobs around Kingston when she could, cleaning houses or helping at local businesses, but she would often disappear for days at a time when she heard about a potential lead. One evening, as Jessica sat on the beach watching the sunset, a young local woman named Carmen approached her. Carmen was about 25 and worked as a teacher at a nearby school. She had been watching Jessica's search efforts for months and finally decided to introduce herself. "I've been praying for you and your daughters," Carmen said quietly, sitting down beside Jessica on the sand. "My students know about your story. They help me look for anything that might wash up on the beaches." Jessica was moved to tears by this kindness from a stranger. Carmen explained that she had organized her students to keep watch along the coastline during their walks to and from school. They all knew what to look for, anything that might have belonged to 2 American teenagers. "We believe in miracles here," Carmen said. "And we believe that love like yours doesn't go unrewarded." If your daughters are out there, God will help you find them. This conversation gave Jessica renewed strength during one of her darkest periods. She began visiting Carmen's school regularly, talking to the children about ocean safety and showing them photos of Mia and Zoe. The children were enthusiastic helpers, promising to keep their eyes open for anything unusual. Dr. Helen Carter had been studying marine life in the Caribbean for 15 years, but she had never seen anything quite like what was happening around the coral reefs near Barbados. The water temperature had risen by almost 2 degrees over the past year, and several species of fish were behaving in ways she had never observed before. That's what brought her to this particular stretch of beach on a humid Tuesday morning in late September. Helen was part of a research team from the University of Miami that was documenting changes in Caribbean marine ecosystems. She had been diving in these waters for 3 days, taking photographs and collecting water samples. The beach where she was working was about as remote as you could get in Barbados. No hotels, no restaurants, no tourists, just white sand, crystal clear water, and rocky outcroppings that had been shaped by thousands of years of waves and storms. She was packing up her equipment around noon when something caught her eye. Wedged between 2 large rocks about 50 feet from where the waves were breaking was something that definitely didn't belong on a natural beach. It looked like a piece of plastic or maybe rubber, covered with sea growth and barnacles. Helen was a marine biologist, which meant she was also an environmentalist. She hated seeing trash on pristine beaches, especially plastic that could harm marine life. She walked over to the rocks, planning to pull out whatever piece of garbage had washed ashore and take it back to dispose of properly. As she got closer, she realized it wasn't just a piece of random trash. It was some kind of container, rectangular and black, with what looked like a clear window on one side. The whole thing was encrusted with barnacles and covered with a thick layer of algae, but the shape was definitely man-made. Helen had seen similar containers before. Her research team used waterproof cases to protect their underwater cameras and equipment. This looked like it might be a camera case, though it was impossible to tell how long it had been in the water. Based on the amount of marine growth covering it, Helen guessed it had been floating in the ocean for months, maybe even a year or more. She carefully worked the case free from the rocks. It was heavier than she expected, which suggested there might still be something inside. The case had several latches that were corroded but still seemed functional. Helen was curious, but she was also careful. As a scientist, she knew that anything she found on the beach could potentially be evidence of something important. Helen carried the case back to her research station, which was basically a folding table set up under a beach umbrella. She had fresh water for rinsing equipment, and she used it to carefully clean off some of the marine growth. As the barnacles and algae came away, she could see that the case was definitely designed to be waterproof. There were rubber seals around the edges and a pressure release valve on one side. The latches were stiff, but they still worked. Helen opened the case carefully, not sure what she might find inside. The first thing she noticed was that the interior was completely dry. Whatever this case was designed to do, it had done its job perfectly. The inside was lined with foam padding, and nestled in the center was a digital camera. Helen lifted the camera out of the case with shaking hands. It was a nice camera, more expensive than the basic point-and-shoot models most tourists carried. There was also a memory card still inserted in the camera, and when Helen turned the camera on, she was amazed to discover that it still worked. The battery was completely dead, but the camera's electronics seemed to be undamaged. Helen had a portable battery charger in her research kit, the kind used to keep electronic equipment running during long field studies. She connected the camera to the charger and waited. After about 20 minutes, the camera had enough power to turn on. The LCD screen flickered to life, and Helen found herself looking at a menu showing 247 photos stored on the memory card. Her heart was beating fast as she scrolled through the photos. The first several dozen were clearly vacation pictures. Beach scenes, resort pools, people posing in front of tropical backgrounds. The photos looked like they had been taken on a cruise ship or at various Caribbean destinations. Helen recognized some of the locations from her own travels in the region, but as she continued scrolling through the photos, the images began to change. The vacation pictures gave way to something much more serious and concerning. The photos showed what appeared to be a small, rocky island with dense vegetation. There were pictures of a crude shelter made from palm fronds and driftwood. Photos of someone's hands holding freshly caught fish. Images of what looked like a signal fire built on a beach. Helen's hands were trembling as she realized what she might be looking at. These weren't vacation photos anymore. These looked like survival photos. Someone had been stranded on an uninhabited island and had documented their experience with this camera. The timestamp on the photos told an incredible story. The vacation pictures were dated from late November of the previous year. But the survival? Photos started in December and continued all the way through March. Someone had been stranded for months, and they had used this camera to document their struggle to stay alive. Helen scrolled faster through the photos, her excitement and concern growing with each image. There were pictures of rainwater collection systems made from pieces of plastic and leaves, photos of edible plants and fruits that someone had gathered, images of tools made from driftwood and stones. Someone had not only survived on this island, they had been smart and resourceful enough to document their experience. But the most shocking discovery came when Helen reached the final photos on the memory card. In the last several pictures, she could clearly see two young people, two girls, who looked to be teenagers, both with long brown hair and fair skin. They were obviously the ones who had taken all the survival photos, probably using the camera's timer function to photograph themselves. The girls looked thin and weathered, their skin tanned dark by months of tropical sun. Their clothes were torn and faded, but they were smiling in several of the photos. They looked like they were trying to stay positive despite their impossible situation. In one photo, they were holding up a large fish they had caught. In another, they were standing next to their shelter, giving thumbs-up signs to the camera. Helen stared at the final photo for several minutes. It was dated just 2 weeks ago, which meant these girls might still be alive, still stranded on whatever island they had photographed. The last picture showed something that made Helen's heart race. Carved into the sand of a beach was what looked like a crude map, with an arrow pointing to a series of marks that might be coordinates. Helen immediately tried to enlarge the photo on the camera's small screen, but she couldn't make out the details clearly enough to read the coordinates. She needed to get these photos to someone who could enhance them and figure out exactly where this island was located. But first, she needed to report this discovery to the authorities. Helen had no idea who these girls were or how they had ended up stranded on a remote island, but she knew that time might be critical. If they were still alive, they needed rescue immediately. Helen packed up her research equipment as quickly as possible and drove straight to the nearest police station in Bridgetown, Barbados. The desk sergeant listened to her story with obvious skepticism at first. Stories about messages in bottles and mysterious photos found on beaches weren't uncommon in a tourist destination like Barbados. But when Helen showed him the photos on the camera, his attitude changed completely. Within an hour, Helen was sitting in a conference room with several police officers, a representative from the Barbados Coast Guard, and a detective who specialized in missing persons cases. They had connected the camera to a larger computer screen, and everyone in the room was studying the survival photos in detail. Detective Thompson, who had 20 years of experience investigating missing persons cases throughout the Caribbean, was particularly interested in the final photo with the map carved in the sand. He had contacts at the regional Coast Guard headquarters who could enhance digital photos and possibly identify the location based on the landmarks visible in the background. How long do you think these girls have been stranded? Detective Thompson asked Helen. Helen pointed to the timestamps on the photos. Based on these dates, they've been on this island for almost 10 months. But the last photo was taken just 2 weeks ago, which means they were still alive very recently. Detective Thompson was already reaching for his phone. We need to get these photos to our technical team immediately. If these girls are still alive, every hour could make the difference. As Helen watched the detective make urgent phone calls, She thought about the two young faces she had seen in those final photos. They had looked tired and thin, but they had also looked determined. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived. For months on what appeared to be a completely uninhabited island, Helen had spent years studying marine ecosystems, but she had never been involved in anything like this. She found herself praying that whoever these girls were, they were still alive and waiting for rescue. And she hoped that her accidental discovery on that remote beach in Barbados had come in time to save them. What Helen didn't know was that hundreds of miles away in Jamaica, a heartbroken mother named Jessica was about to receive a phone call that... The phone call came at 6:30 in the morning, Jamaican time. Jessica had been awake for hours, sitting on the small balcony of her hotel room, watching the sunrise over Kingston Harbor. She had barely slept in the 10 months since her daughters disappeared, and this morning was no different. When her phone rang, she almost didn't answer it. Most calls these days were from bill collectors or well-meaning relatives trying to convince her to come home, but something made her pick up the phone. The voice on the other end was professional and calm. It was Detective Thompson from the Barbados Police Department. He explained that they had found something that might be related to her missing daughters, and he needed her to come to Barbados immediately. Jessica's hands shook as she wrote down the flight information. Detective Thompson wouldn't tell her details over the phone, but his tone suggested this was serious. For the first time in months, Jessica felt a flutter of real hope in her chest. She threw some clothes into a bag and caught the first flight to Barbados. At the police station in Bridgetown, Detective Thompson showed Jessica the photos from the camera that Dr. Carter had found. When Jessica saw the first clear picture of Mia and Zoe, she collapsed into a chair and sobbed for 20 minutes. Her daughters were alive, thin, weathered, obviously struggling, but alive. "When was this photo taken?" Jessica asked, pointing to the last picture of the girls. 2 weeks ago, Detective Thompson replied, "which means they were alive very recently. Our technical team has been working all night to enhance this final photo with the map. We think we know where they are." The enhanced image showed coordinates carved into the sand, along with what appeared to be landmarks that could help identify the specific island. The Coast Guard had cross-referenced the coordinates with satellite imagery and identified a small, uninhabited island about 60 miles southeast of Barbados. It was so small and remote that it didn't even appear on most navigation charts. Within hours, a rescue operation was launched. Jessica insisted on being part of the search, and Detective Thompson agreed to let her fly out on one of the Coast Guard helicopters. As they flew over the Caribbean waters, Jessica pressed her face against the window, scanning the endless blue ocean for any sign of land. The island, when they finally spotted it, was tiny. Maybe half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, with a narrow beach surrounded by rocks and dense tropical vegetation. From the air, it looked like the kind of place that might not see human visitors for years at a time. The helicopter pilot found a small clearing where he could land safely. As soon as the aircraft touched down, Jessica was out and running toward the beach. Her heart was pounding as she called out her daughters' names. "Mia! Zoe! It's Mom! We're here!" For a moment, there was only the sound of waves and wind. Then, from somewhere in the dense vegetation behind the beach, Jessica heard the most beautiful sound in the world. 2 voices, weak but unmistakable, calling back to her. "Mom?" "M.O." Mia and Zoe emerged from the jungle like ghosts. They were incredibly thin, their skin dark from months of sun exposure, their hair bleached and tangled. Their clothes were little, more than rags held together with plant fibers and strips of fabric. But they were alive, and they were running toward their mother with tears streaming down their faces. The reunion was overwhelming. Jessica held both her daughters at once, all 3 of them crying and laughing and trying to talk at the same time. The Coast Guard medics immediately began checking the girls' vital signs, but Jessica didn't want to let go of them for even a second. "We knew you'd find us," Zoe whispered into her mother's ear. "We never stopped believing you'd come." Mia nodded. Weakly, "We saw the helicopters sometimes, flying way up high. We tried to signal them, but they never saw us. We kept hoping that one day you would be on one of those helicopters." As the medics worked, the girls began to tell their story. It was even more incredible than anyone had imagined. They hadn't fallen off the cruise ship accidentally. They had witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, and their lives had been in danger on that night 10 months ago. Mia and Zoe had left the teen club and gone exploring the ship. They were curious teenagers who wanted to see parts of the cruise ship that were off-limits to passengers. They had found a service stairway that led to the crew areas, and they decided to sneak down and look around. What they discovered was a drug smuggling operation involving several crew members. In a storage room deep in the ship's lower decks, they saw large packages being moved and repackaged. They heard conversations in multiple languages about deliveries and payments. The girls realized they were witnessing something illegal and dangerous. They tried to leave quietly, but one of the crew members spotted them. Suddenly, they were being chased through the narrow corridors of the ship's service areas. The men were shouting in languages the girls didn't understand, but their intentions were clear. They couldn't let two teenage witnesses live to report what they had seen. In their panic to escape, Mia and Zoe ran toward what they thought was an exit. Instead, they found themselves on a small service deck near the ship's waterline. The men were close behind them, and the girls could hear angry voices getting closer. In desperation, they jumped overboard, hoping to swim to safety, or at least hide in the water until the ship passed, but the ocean at night was rougher than they had expected. The cruise ship was moving fast, and within minutes, it was just lights disappearing in the distance. The girls found themselves alone in the dark water, with no life jackets and no way to signal for help. They had been incredibly lucky. The currents carried them toward the small island where they would eventually be stranded. They managed to reach the rocky shore just as the sun was coming up. Exhausted and terrified but alive, the first few days on the island were the hardest. They had no fresh water, no food, and no shelter. But the girls discovered they were stronger and more resourceful than they had ever imagined. They found a small freshwater spring in the center of the island. They learned to catch fish with improvised spears made from sticks and rocks. They built a shelter from palm fronds and driftwood. Mia had been carrying the waterproof camera case that night because she wanted to take pictures at the teen club. When they reached the island, it was one of the few possessions they still had. They used the camera to document their survival, partly as a record of their experience and partly as a way to stay hopeful that someone would eventually find them. "We took turns being the strong one," Zoe explained to her mother as they sat together on the beach. "When Mia was scared or sad, I would take care of her. When I wanted to give up, Mia would remind me that you were looking for us." The girls had survived on fish, coconuts, rainwater, and various edible plants they found on the island. They had learned to make fire by rubbing sticks together. They had weathered several tropical storms by taking shelter in a cave they found in the island's rocky interior. Most importantly, they had never stopped trying to signal for rescue. They built signal fires whenever they saw aircraft overhead. They arranged rocks and debris on the beach to spell out help in letters large enough to be seen from the air. They had even tried to build a raft to escape the island, but the ocean currents were too strong for their improvised craft. The final photo with the map coordinates had been their last desperate attempt to get a message to the outside world. They had hoped that if the camera ever washed ashore somewhere, someone would find it and understand where they were stranded. As the Coast Guard helicopter lifted off from the island, carrying Jessica and her daughters back to civilization, Jessica looked down at the tiny piece of land that had been their home for 10 months. It seemed impossible that two 16-year-old girls could have survived there for so long, but they had done it through determination, teamwork, and an unshakable belief that their mother would never stop looking for them. The drug smuggling ring was eventually exposed and prosecuted, with several crew members from the cruise ship receiving long prison sentences. The cruise line faced millions of dollars in lawsuits and was forced to completely overhaul their security procedures. But for Jessica, Mia, and Zoe, the legal battles and media attention were secondary concerns. They were focused on healing as a family and moving forward together. The girls needed months of medical care and counseling to recover from their ordeal, but they were alive and they were home. Jessica had spent 10 months searching the Caribbean for her daughters, refusing to give up hope when everyone else believed they were gone. Her faith in a mother's instinct had been proven right in the most dramatic way possible. Sometimes love really is strong enough to overcome impossible odds. The camera that Dr. Carter found on that remote beach in Barbados now sits in Jessica's living room, a reminder of the miracle that brought her family back together. And sometimes, late at night, Jessica still can't quite believe that her daughter's incredible survival story really happened. But then she looks at Mia and Zoe, healthy and happy and home where they belong, and she knows that some stories are too amazing to be anything but true.